Okay, everyone. I am going to give you a demonstration of a rhetorical analysis so that you have hopefully a clear idea of what you're doing for this paper. So I'm going to show you a list of questions, first of all, that's going to help you get started thinking about what should be in the rhetorical analysis. And then I am going to um, do a sample rhetorical analysis for you. Just walk you through what it would look like to do a rhetorical analysis of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so on the course site, you should have a page under the module for this week that says questions for rhetorical analysis. And these are some things that you would look for or consider as you're writing this type of paper. So, one, what is the context of the argument? This is asking you to think about the rhetorical situation. What has happened that has made this argument necessary? Um, what um, what is the situation or the moment that the author is speaking to? Right? What is the claim and to what audience is it made? So, what is the person arguing for? In the case of Sojourner Truth, she's arguing for rights for women, including education. If it's Martin Luther King Jr. and Letter from Birmingham Jail, he's arguing for civil rights for African Americans. And that gaining civil rights is something that needs to happen right away, not something that can happen gradually over a long period of time. Right? And to what audience is it made? Remember that we discussed three types of audiences. The person making the argument might name an audience in their speech. That's an invoked audience. But they might have an audience in mind that they're not naming in the speech, somebody to whom the audience is really directed, even though they're not named. That would be an intended audience. And then the real audience is just anybody who happens to come upon this particular piece of oratory. Either they read it in a history book or they watched it on YouTube, whatever. For this type of paper, you only need to worry about the invoked audience and the intended audience. So, what is the claim? What is the speaker arguing? Who do they need to convince? And what do they want them to do? Right? What supports, appeals, evidence are used? In a sense, those three words can be three ways of naming the same thing, right? The appeals do support the argument, and evidence specifically is part of the logos or the logic of the argument. But it helps sometimes to think about those from those three different angles. So, supports could be the logical arguments, the evidence that's being offered, could be conclusions drawn from that evidence. All of that is part of the logos. Could be the emotional appeals, the pathos of the argument are part of the support. Could be any statements that assert or are based on the speaker's authority or expertise. So, in the case of Sojourner Truth, when she makes an argument based on her experiences as an enslaved person, both the fact that she has had to do the same work as a man, but also the fact that as an enslaved person, nobody gave her such niceties, such social considerations as being helped into carriages or having the door open for her. So, from that experience, gives her some authority to say, look, what you've described as the experience of women, that has not been my experience. And you know what? I did just fine. I held my own with the other men working in the field, right? I can get myself into and out of the wagon. I did just fine. I'm as strong as any man, right? So her experience gives her some authority to speak out of. So what supports are being used, and then does the author anticipate and answer objections? Does the author, yeah, I think that's probably pretty clear as it is, but do you see the author trying to get ahead of the other side's argument and answer any concerns that they might have with his or her position before the other side has a chance to make that objection? All right, so what language choices are significant? And this could be anything from specific word choices, like the author is choosing to call something this and not that. It could be a reflection on the author's style of speaking. So King has a very elevated style of speaking, a very poetic style, both in writing and in public speech. That fits his role as a minister, right? As a preacher in the Black church, that poetic style fits within a specific tradition of preaching. But also, he's speaking on a national stage to national issues, and he's citing from the very highest authorities, the Bible and the Constitution, and the great intellectual giants of Western civilization. That's a very high style. With Sojourner Truth, I find it interesting that we have two different versions of her speech. The one that is closest to within just a few weeks of her actually giving the speech shows her using pretty standard English, whereas the version that's published years later, uh, writes the speech as though um, Truth were someone who had been enslaved in the deep south with this, with the slave dialect from Georgia or Mississippi. As it happened, Sojourner Truth had been enslaved in New York State. She had never lived in the deep south and didn't speak like someone who came from that part of American culture. So does this tell you anything about how should this should this tell you anything about Sojourner Truth's audience and how they saw her or how she presented herself? That first version of the speech, the one with the correct grammar, is the one where she collaborated with the publisher to make sure that her speech was being reproduced as accurately as possible. So, what can we take away from the differences in styles in those two versions of the speech? You might also think in terms of language. Humor is technically considered part of pathos if the author is intentionally being humorous as a way to make the speech more interesting or compelling to an audience. You might include that in a discussion of supports and appeals. But it might also belong in a discussion of language if the author is choosing to say things in a particularly humorous way. You might also think about language that is just beautiful or compelling in some way. Or maybe language that's dramatic, that's going to have the audience on the edge of its seat. Okay. Is the author successful? So, you know, a lot of the rhetoric that we are looking at in this class has been transformative in some way, right? This is rhetoric that had an impact on society. So in that sense, you could argue that most of them are successful. this might be something, you want to bring in if you're thinking about how to frame your rhetorical analysis. What's the best approach to take to get at the analysis, talking about why something is or is not successful. That can be one way to do it. You're not required, to write a paper on why this speech is or is not successful, but thinking about it that way might get you a little bit closer to your thesis. And then another question, which may or may not be helpful, what can we learn from the author's rhetorical strategy? So maybe there's something that the author is doing here that is why this speech is so impactful, why this speech did succeed against the odds, because there was something really clever or brilliant about how the author framed the argument. So, do you need to answer every single one of these questions in your rhetorical analysis? Well, more or less. With the last two, particularly, I mentioned that they might not be necessary. The first five, I would say they're usually necessary. For number three, you might find that certain types of appeals aren't used in an argument. Most successful rhetoric, most good rhetoric is going to have ethos, pathos, and logos in it. An exception might be academic arguments. You're not evaluating any of those, but academic arguments famously exclude pathos, right? It's not done to use an emotional argument in academic writing. But otherwise, generally rhetoric is going to make use of all three of these. So if one of them is missing, that might also be something that you want to consider. You might want to think about, why is it that this particular argument seems pretty weak on logic? Or why is it that this author keeps emotional appeals to an absolute minimum, right? There might be some acknowledgement of feelings around the issue, but the speaker is making it clear that he or she just doesn't want to go there. Why would that be? If the person making the argument doesn't seem to have much credibility on the issue, like, what is this person's expertise? What is their experience that they're writing this out of? And if they don't have that, if they're just another person with an opinion, that doesn't mean you can't hear them out, but maybe you want to take that into consideration when you're deciding how much weight to give to their argument. Okay, so now that we've laid out some things that you'll want to consider, let's take a quick look at the Declaration of Independence, and I'll walk you through how we might think about these. All right, so the Declaration of Independence, famously signed in 1776. I am using, if you look up here, the URL, I'm using the transcripted version from archives.gov. So this is the federal government's transcription of what the Declaration of Independence says. All right, so what is the context for the Declaration of Independence? Well, it's issued at the beginning of the American Revolution. This is the document in which the American colonies declare their independence from Great Britain and assert their right to self-determination and self-governance. Who is the audience for this? Well, Jefferson gives an invoked audience, but there's also an intended audience. So let's look and see if we can figure out who that is. All right, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. There's a significant word there, right? Up until now, we've always spoken of them as the 13 colonies. Suddenly, we're not calling ourselves colonies anymore. We're calling ourselves states. State is a term that can be used interchangeably with nation, right? And there's, in the early years of the American Republic, some controversy, right? Do we think of ourselves as a conglomeration of so many separate nation states, or are these states part of one nation, etc.? But that term states is significant, right? We're thinking about ourselves. By the way, we settled that debate during the Civil War, right? The states are part of one united nation. Um, but the term states is significant, not colonies. So the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. Now, this is setting up the direction in which the argument will go. This document is about one nation dissolving the political bands connecting it to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them. So this is about separating from another nation and setting ourselves up as a separate and equal government. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Right, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind gives us our invoked audience. Who is Thomas Jefferson's audience here? Well, the audience he's appealing to directly by name is all of mankind. Right? When the United States makes this very controversial decision to separate politically from the mother country and establish ourselves as an independent government, we need for the rest of humanity to think well of us in that decision. We need the international community, as we would say now. I'm not sure they used that term then, but that's very much what Jefferson's thinking. We need the international community to support us. Now, who is his intended audience? Is his intended audience all mankind? Well, to some extent. I mean, Jefferson is definitely writing for posterity here, so future generations can look back on his rhetoric and understand what the American project is. Absolutely. But he's also got some specific audiences in mind. He and the rest of the committee, right? It's not just Jefferson. Ben Franklin and John Adams are also collaborating with him on this. Jefferson is the one doing the actual writing and word choosing. Who do they really need to convince? Well, first of all, not all the American colonists are on board with this idea of being politically independent. There are a lot of people in the American colonies who still think that they can convince Great Britain to let them have more rights and more self-government without actually breaking away. And then also, if they do declare independence, they're going to need support from international allies. Right? There's no way that the American colonies are strong enough to stand up to Great Britain by themselves. They're going to need somebody else to come in on their side. France or Spain, maybe even Russia. They need to convince somebody to help us out. Right? Eventually, it's France, but we need allies. So how would I put this in a rhetorical analysis? Well, I might say that Jefferson's invoked audience is all of humanity. It's all mankind. His intended audience, specifically, he wants Americans to be united behind the Declaration of Independence, and he wants international allies to come to the aid of the colonies. Okay. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. We didn't really get a chance to talk about the Toulmin model. I can summarize it very briefly here by saying that Stephen Toulmin was interested in why some arguments are never resolved. Why are there some issues that we just argue back and forth about constantly, and one side never ever succeeds in convincing the other? Toulmin concluded that this is because we can put all our evidence on the table, we can have all our supports, all our appeals. At the end of the day, if we are coming to the discussion with very different assumptions about the world, then we're not necessarily going to be convinced by the other side's arguments. Toulmin used the word warrants, by the way. A warrant was an assumption underlying an argument. And those assumptions can be stated or unstated, right? We can say out loud what we assume to be true about the world, or it can be subtext. It can be something that we're silent about and it's there. It's underlying the argument, but we never actually say that quiet part out loud. Jefferson is saying it out loud. This whole paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident. This is a whole paragraph of warrants. This is the founding fathers, the Continental Congress, the shapers of the American project, saying what they assume or believe to be true about the world, the assumptions on which all the rest of their arguments will be based. And those assumptions are these. First of all men are created equal, right? In contrast to the idea most prominently held in Europe, that some people are simply of better quality than others due to the circumstances of their birth or their lineage, the Americans are saying, no, actually, all of us have equal value and all of us are endowed with unalienable rights. All of us are given rights, are born with rights that must not be taken away from us. Where do we get these rights? From our Creator, God-given rights that should not be taken away from us. And government's job is to secure those rights. Now, this is not how everybody thought about government in the 18th century, right? The fact that most people would have told you that government was about the fact that human beings are inherently flawed and we need something to whip us into line. Right? Now, the founding fathers are not saying we don't need to restrain evil, but they're reframing it. Government restrains evil because it exists to secure people's rights. So, for instance, government punishes murderers, right? It restrains the violent because all of us have a right to life. And so those who would take away the rights of others must be restrained, right? That's government securing the rights of the people and deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So government must have the consent of the governed, or it's not good government. Again, this is completely opposite to how many people in the 18th century would have thought about government. In the 18th century, many people still subscribe to the idea of the divine right of kings. God sets up kings and sets down kings, and the king's authority comes directly from God. So you had better not cross the king, or you'll be disobedient to God because you've done that. In the Declaration of Independence, there's divine right, but it doesn't belong to kings. It belongs to the people. The people are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. Government can only secure those rights. It can only do so insofar as the people empower it to do so. When government becomes destructive of these ends, down here, when government ceases to govern by consent, when it ceases to protect the rights of the people, then the people have the right to either change the government or abolish it and replace it with something new. Okay. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. People will put up with a lot, and they will put up with it for a long time. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, notice that word usurpations, that's an important word in the Declaration of Independence. To usurp is to claim an authority that doesn't rightfully belong to you. So when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, so when a long train of abuses turns into outright tyranny, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Now, I've kind of camped on this paragraph for a moment, partly because this is the entire governing philosophy of the United States in a nutshell. So it kind of matters that we acknowledge that before moving on, but also because this is going to set up the logic of Jefferson's argument. Jefferson is arguing that good government is government which protects the people's rights and which operates with the consent of the people. When government doesn't do that, it needs to be replaced. So now he's going to transition into offering evidence, right? He said that the American colonies want to break away from Great Britain and form their own government. So what abuses have they been subject to that make that necessary? If people are always going to be reluctant to throw off the way of life that they've been used to and do something else, what awful thing has happened that has made this necessary here? Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. I told you that word would keep coming up, all having indirect object the establishment of an absolute tyranny. That seems like another word that might be important to talk about over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. All right, and here comes the support for his argument. So his claim is that the British government is a bad government that needs to be replaced, or at least the British government in America is a bad government that needs to be replaced. So here is all of his support for that claim. The he and all these lines, of course, is King George III. We're not going to read through every single one of these, but let's see if we can't get a sense of what Jefferson is arguing here. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. Right. So you get all these arguments for why the administration of law under George III has not been good. Notice that Jefferson is making his verbs do the work of this sentence. Refused, forbidden, refused, dissolved, refused. He has endeavored to prevent, obstructed. He has made judges dependent. erected a multitude of new offices. Do you see how a lot of these verbs, not only is he putting emphasis on verbs, but he's choosing verbs that have a negative connotation: refused, dissolved, obstructed. Um, these are not words with which we have any positive associations. Look further down. Cutting off our trade. There's something else: imposing taxes, depriving, abolishing. Again, all of these verbs abdicated. Um, all of these suggest negative actions on the part of the king. Look down under, he has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. What do those words make you think of? Plundered, ravaged, burnt, destroyed. If you're thinking piracy on the high seas, I think you've got the gist of what Jefferson is trying to suggest, that King George's actions have been so far outside the norm, so far out beyond the pale, that he's practically a pirate with the way he's treated the American people. And if at this point you're wondering, is Jefferson exaggerating any of this? I'm not a historian. I know historians debate about this. You could find a root in fact for all of these charges that he's making. They're not out of thin air. Whether or not his language, his word choices are inflating that evidence, that's a historical question, not a rhetorical one. All you really need to answer here, rhetorically speaking, is that he's using a lot of negative and inflammatory language to describe the king's actions, while at the same time, he's also describing very specific things that the king has done. Right? It's not just, the king is bad because he's a king and not elected, and that's bad. I mean, he's actually giving you some specific ways that royal government in America um, has not been for the benefit of Americans. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country. He's referring to the practice of impressment. Literally, sailors could be taken off merchant ships and forced to serve in the British Navy, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. Clearly, this is before, any era that cared about political correctness, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Is that a fair representation of American Indians? No. It is an accurate representation of how many Americans perceived them at the time. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Right here is where he comes to his counter argument. He's anticipating that the objection to this, and he doesn't have to anticipate much because the objection to independence all along has been, yes, there are abuses, but we should petition, we should lobby the government to reform the way things are done in America. We should lobby in defense of our rights. Right. So Jefferson is saying at every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Right? If it walks like a tyrant, talks like a tyrant, quacks like a tyrant, he must be a tyrant. It's basically Jefferson's argument. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. So here he's answering the idea, well, maybe we just need enough public support in Great Britain itself, and that will pressure Parliament to treat us differently. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature, notice that language, Is Parliament the American legislature? No, it's the British legislature. Attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. So Parliament making laws for us instead of our colonial legislatures making laws for us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here, still talking about the British people. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, there's that word again, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. Consanguinity means shared blood. We must therefore acquiesce. To acquiesce is to accept silently, right? So we're just going to have to accept that this is who they are. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. So that's his rebuttal to the counter argument, right? You can talk all you want to about petitioning. That hasn't worked. You can talk about appealing to the British public to pressure Parliament. That hasn't worked. So what's left to us? We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. This is the thesis of the Declaration of Independence. Yes, it does have one. Not every argument that you will do a rhetorical analysis of has such a clear thesis. This one does. And notice where it's at. It's not at the beginning, which is where a thesis usually goes. I mean, there's a reason why I taught you to put the thesis in the introduction. It usually does go at the beginning. If the author has put the thesis somewhere else, there's a specific reason for that. And you can probably guess, because when I do this in a classroom and students are in the classroom, usually people guess pretty quickly. It's because he knows that his audience is going to be reluctant to accept this conclusion. The conclusion that the United States ought to be free and independent is one that will lead to war. People will die because of this claim that Jefferson is making. It is not one to make lightly, and it isn't one that his audience is going to come to readily. He's going to have to talk them toward that thesis. So the beginning of the Declaration of Independence lets you know, it indicates that this is going to be about one people choosing to separate from another. But then all the evidence comes next, right? And then the thesis comes after the evidence, because Jefferson is letting the evidence lead you to this conclusion that independence is the only possible solution to the political problem that the American colonies, now states, are facing. So they are, and they are entitled to be free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection to Great Britain ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. And if we were going to talk about the ethos, the credibility behind the Declaration of Independence, it's in this last line. That firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, that's an appeal to God This is still a period of history in which most people are religious, and the overwhelming majority of people that Jefferson particularly needs to convince with the Declaration of Independence are not only religious but identify as Christians. So this is stating um, this is stating a reliance on God as a way of demonstrating to the audience the ethical foundation that the founders are basing their argument on. And then we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So the notion that, we're putting our own honor and lives on the line is also part of the credibility. And by the way, take that very seriously. Um, the men who signed the Declaration of Independence knew perfectly well that if they lost and they were captured, they were all going to be hanged on the closest liberty tree. So they didn't say this lightly, and the audience would not have taken it lightly. Okay, so what are our last questions? Well, obviously, the argument is successful, right? Because here we all are in the United States of America 250 years later. Are there anything we can learn from Jefferson's rhetorical strategy? I'm not sure that Jefferson does anything rhetorically new here. In some ways, this is a very classical approach to argument, almost a textbook example of how to structure and build an argument. However, what is interesting about the Declaration of Independence is that Jefferson doesn't just succeed in explaining why the United States needs to be the United States, right? Why we need to be a politically independent entity. In the process, by spelling out all of these assumptions and beliefs that the American argument for independence is based on, Jefferson gives America a philosophy of government. G.K. Chesterton, famous British writer, famously said that America was the only country in the world founded on a creed. That is a statement of belief. And the statement of belief begins with, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And all the rest about equality and unalienable rights and government by consent of the governed, all of that is part of that American creed. What that means is that by writing out these reasons for independence, Jefferson is not only justifying the American Revolution, he's defining what it means to be American. So if I had to say, what do we learn from the author's rhetorical strategy? Well, I would say, his rhetorical strategy is, the statement of belief to justify the revolution. But in the process, he succeeds in doing something bigger than that and defining the ideals that underlie the American project. Okay, well, I hope that gives you some idea of what a rhetorical analysis can do. If you have any questions, you can always feel free to email them to me as always. Otherwise, I will look forward to reading your papers.